Hello everybody and welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to talk about action potential. So what is action potential? Action potential defines the electrical activity that runs through the cell in order to potentiate an action. So it's really what it takes to give us an action, and we're going to see the electric current of the ion and what it takes to propagate the action as well. So in order to jump into the topic, we need to understand some few things first. So normally, if this is a picture of our cell, inside the cell is more negative as compared to the outside of the cell. So I'm just going to put negative here. And why the inside the cell is negative is because of the different ions, the difference of the ions that we have inside the cell versus outside of the cell. So inside the cell, we have ions like potassium that are predominant inside the cell. We have magnesium, we have protein, and phosphorus. So these are the ions that are mostly inside the cell. Now for the outside the cell, we have more of the sodium than the inside. We have the chloride and we have the bicarb. These are all located mostly outside of the cell. Now, all these different changes that these ions have determine why we have the cell which is more negative inside. Now, at the resting potential membrane, which is negative 70, this is how our membrane is functional. Now, to better understand it, I'm gonna do a diagram here. And here on the x-axis is gonna be time. On the y is gonna be voltage. Now here I'm gonna have negative 70. Let's do here negative 90, negative 50. And the more we go up, it's gonna be more positive. And now I'm gonna draw our action potential, and we're gonna talk about it as we're going. So we said at a resting state, our membrane has a voltage of negative 70. Now, if a stimulus happen into that cell, let's say if you get bite and you started being in pain, any kind of stimulus, let's say we apply a stimulus here, it's gonna raise our membrane action potential until it reaches the threshold. We're gonna take negative 50 as our threshold. So now, once it reaches the threshold, if the stimulus is able to reach the threshold of negative 50, now we're gonna have a generation of the action potential. The cells are gonna depolarize their membranes. Now, if our threshold is negative 50 and we have a stimulus that is not able to reach the threshold, we will not have this depolarization. So what does this mean when the cell depolarize? So in the situation of depolarization, this is still our cell, and these are the component of our cell. Now, in the situation of depolarizes, the sodium, which was outside the cell, along with chloride, let's say, these are our ion outside the cell. So when we have a depolarization, the sodium is going to massively go inside the cell through some ionic channels here. Now, when the sodium gets inside the cell becomes more positive because of the charges become more positive here, which create the depolarization. Now, at this point, there are some ion interaction that can cause us like some disturbance of this process. Let's say we have a hypocalcemia, a decrease in blood calcium is going to keep the sodium channel here open. So if we have hypocalcemia, the decrease in blood calcium is going to favorize the sodium ion channel open. So we're going to have more sodium going inside the cell. We're going to have an increase in depolarization, and it's going to give us symptoms like tetany, hyperactivity of our reflexes, because the cell is becoming more positive and is depolarizing. Now, when the action potential reaches its max right here, and the cell is going to say, oh no, I'm becoming more positive, I need to fix my charges, what is going to happen is the cell is going to repolarize. So the cell is going to try to come back to its resting state. And in order to repolarize, it's going to try to equilibrate the charge so we have more negative inside the cell. So during the repolarizing phase, and this is our cell and the different ions, and outside of the cell here with our sodium, bicarb, and chloride. So in order to make the cell more negative as it was before, the cell is going to try to push the potassium out. So by pushing the potassium out, the cell is going to go back to its original space. So during the depolarization, the sodium comes in, and during the repolarization, the potassium go out the cell. Now, during the repolarization and depolarization, we have what we call refractory phases. So the refractory phase, we have absolute refractory and relative refractory. So during the refractory phase is the time that if we apply a stimulus to the cell, we are not going to get a response or greater the response that we already have. So here at this phase, our sodium channels are open and active because the sodium is able to get inside the cell. And during this phase, our potassium channel is open and the sodium channel are deactivating. So right here, our potassium channel start getting opening and the sodium channel are deactivating. That is the absolutely refractory period because the potassium is trying to push out while the sodium is trying to close itself. Is the absolute refractory period. Now, what happened sometime when the cell tries to come back to its resting potential, we can have an hyperpolarization. That means there is an extension of potassium out. The potassium is still coming out here. This is our relative refractory period right here. So right here, the sodium channels are already deactivated. So if we give a stimulus that reaches the threshold while the membrane is hyperpolarized, we can have an action potential. So here the membrane are hyperpolarizing. Now let's talk a little bit about the hyperpolarization of the membrane. So hyperpolarization essentially means the membrane is becoming more negative than it was before in its resting state. Now we know that in the resting state is already negative, but when it gets more negative than the resting state, because potassium keep coming out. Potassium is a cation, so the membrane is becoming more positive, more negative inside, causing the hyperpolarization. So this hyperpolarization is gonna make our membrane less able to stimulate. So it's gonna decrease the excitability of our membrane, because if our membrane is right here, that means our stimulus has to travel the more to reach the threshold to give us an action potential. But when the membrane is less negative here, the threshold is closer. So during hyperpolarization, the membrane is less excitable. Now, see, we have also disturbance of this action potential phase according to potassium. Now, let's say we have hypokalemia, we have less potassium in the blood. So in a situation of hypokalemia, and this is our cell, we are still in the repolarization phase. The cell is trying to pump out the potassium to go back to the resting state. But if out here we don't even have enough potassium, what is going to happen? The cell is going to quickly eject the potassium out very fast to reach his normal resting state. But during that phase of pumping the potassium out, it can pass his original resting state and become even more negative than it was before at a basal state. So this is what we call hyperpolarization. And when that happened, we say the cell was less excitable, and that is why in hypokalemia, we have decrease in muscle tone, lethargy, muscle reflex are fainted, because the cell are becoming less excitable. But if we notice during our EKG, if a patient has an hypokalemia, we're going to have ventricular dysrhythmia. So ventricular dysrhythmia happen in hypokalemia just because when the cells are hyperpolarizing in the myocarditis, in the muscle cell of the heart, we're going to have an activation of the HCN channels. And these channels are going to stimulate the ventricle, everything below the AV node. These channels are going to stimulate the ventricle. It's going to give us ventricular fibrillation, ventricular tachycardia. And that's why we have hypokalemia with ventricular dysrhythmia. And it's going to be the reverse with the hyperkalemia. This channel pumping out the potassium where there is already a lot of potassium outside. So it's going to be, woof, everything is going to be high. So we're going to have hyperreflexia of our tendon. We're going to have hyper muscle tone, and everything is going to be hyper. But again, on our heart, we're going to have bradycardia, we're going to have cardiac arrest, because the cells of the heart are very sensitive to potassium. So this is the physiology of the action potential and how these different ions can actually impact our cellular response according to the amount of different ion in and out of the cell. So if you find this helpful, please share, like, and subscribe, and I will see you on my next video. Thank you.